The island of Corsica sits in the warm Mediterranean Sea, not far from the coast of Italy, where the air carries the scent of maqui, a low, fragrant scrubland of rosemary, lavender, and wild herbs that grows across the hillsides in soft, silvery green drifts. The landscape there is gentle in places, rocky in others, with small harbors where fishing boats rest in quiet water and the afternoons settle into long, slow hours of warmth. It was on this island, in the town of Ajaccio, in the late summer of 1769, that a boy was born into a family of modest Italian Corsican ancestry. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and the world into which he arrived was one of small rooms, modest meals, and the ordinary rhythms of a provincial town. His mother, Letizia, was a calm and practical woman, known throughout her life for a certain quiet steadiness. She managed her household with care and economy, as was necessary for a family of 8 children. The Bonaparte home in Ajaccio was a respectable but not grand house, with stone walls that stayed cool in the summer heat, and rooms that were furnished simply, as was common in the Mediterranean towns of that era. The children played in the narrow streets outside, and in the evenings the family gathered in the way that Mediterranean families do, around meals that were slow and communal. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, was a lawyer and a man of some local standing. He traveled occasionally to the French mainland in connection with his work and with the affairs of the Corsican nobility, for the island had come under French administration just the year before Napoleon was born. Carlo was a sociable man, somewhat ambitious for his family, and it was through his efforts that the Bonaparte children were eventually placed in positions that gave them access to French institutions. Napoleon himself, as a boy, spoke Italian and the Corsican dialect at home, and only gradually acquired French, a language he would use for the rest of his life, though always with a faint accent that marked his origins. The Corsican childhood was one of outdoor life, of long afternoons among the hills and along the shoreline, of a closeness to the natural world that comes easily in places where the seasons are mild and the land is not too tame. Napoleon was known in these years as an energetic and somewhat serious child, more given to concentrated activity than to idle play. He had a fondness for mathematics, a subject that came naturally to him, and he showed early on a kind of orderly, practical intelligence that would remain with him throughout his life. When he was 9 years old, Napoleon left Corsica to attend school in France. This was a significant transition, not a dramatic rupture, but the kind of quiet displacement that shapes a person slowly over years. He was enrolled first at Autun, a small cathedral town in the Burgundy region of eastern France, where he spent a few months learning French in preparation for further study. Autun was an ancient place, with Roman ruins still visible in parts of the town, and a great cathedral that had stood for centuries in the center of the community. The streets there were quiet, the pace of life unhurried, and for a boy newly arrived from the Mediterranean, the gray skies and cooler temperatures of Burgundy would have been a gentle novelty. From Autun, Napoleon moved to the Royal Military Academy at Brienne-le-Château, a small town in the Champagne region, where he spent 5 years as a student. Brienne was a modest place, set among flat fields and gentle woodlands, with a chateau that gave the town its character without dominating it. The school itself was one of several royal military schools established across France to educate boys from the lesser nobility who were intended for military careers. Life there followed a regular schedule: lessons in the morning, exercise in the afternoon, meals in common, and study in the evenings. It was an ordered, institutional existence, and Napoleon adapted to it with characteristic focus. The curriculum at Brienne included mathematics, geography, history, and the elements of military science. Napoleon excelled in mathematics and showed a consistent aptitude for subjects that required precision and logical reasoning. He read widely in his spare time, with a particular interest in history and classical texts. He was quieter socially than some of his classmates, and his foreign origins set him apart in minor ways: his accent, his name, the fact that he had come from a place most of his French classmates knew little about. But these differences were not severe, and the years at Brienne gave him a thorough grounding in the intellectual life of 18th-century France. 18th-century France was a country of enormous variety and richness, spread across a vast landscape of mountains, rivers, plains, and coastlines. In the north, flat agricultural land stretched toward the English Channel, where fishing villages perched on white cliffs and the sea was often gray. In the south, the climate softened into something warmer, and the light took on that particular quality of Mediterranean afternoons, golden and slow. Along the Loire Valley, the great chateaux of the French nobility rose among vineyards and orchards, their facades reflected in quiet rivers. In the Alps and the Pyrenees, mountain villages sat at high altitudes, surrounded by pastures and forests and the clean, thin air of elevation. Paris, the capital, was already by this period one of the great cities of the world, dense, lively, and full of intellectual ferment. Its streets ranged from broad, fashionable boulevards lined with townhouses and shops, to narrow medieval lanes where craftsmen worked in small workshops and the smell of bread and tallow candles drifted from open doorways. The Seine moved through the city in long, gentle curves, its banks lined with booksellers who set out their wares in open boxes, and with fishermen who spent whole afternoons in patient stillness at the water's edge. The city had its gardens, the Tuileries, the Palais Royal, where people walked in the evenings among clipped hedges and the sound of distant conversation. There were coffee houses where men sat for hours discussing ideas, and markets where the produce of the surrounding countryside arrived each morning in carts and was laid out on wooden stalls. French society in this era was organized in ways that were both intricate and, in many places, beginning quietly to shift. The nobility held positions of formal privilege, the church maintained its presence in education and daily life, and the great majority of the population lived in villages and small towns, working the land through the seasons in patterns that had changed only gradually over many centuries. A farmer in the Beauce or the Limousin would have recognized much of the agricultural world of his great-grandparents. The rhythms of planting and harvest, the marking of the year by religious festivals and saints' days, the slow movement of livestock along country lanes, these things had a continuity that made life feel stable and rooted, even as ideas and institutions in the cities were beginning, very slowly, to move. Napoleon left Brienne in 1784 and continued his education at the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military school in France. The institution occupied a large, elegant building near the Champ de Mars, a vast open field on the left bank of the Seine that would, in later decades, become one of the city's great public spaces. The École Militaire prepared its students for commissions in the French army, and the curriculum there was rigorous and practical, with an emphasis on artillery and military engineering. Napoleon completed in 1 year a course that typically took 2 or 3, passing his examinations with particular distinction in mathematics and the technical aspects of gunnery. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery at the age of 16, and assigned to a regiment stationed in Valence, a town in the Rhône Valley in southern France. The Rhône Valley is a long, sun-drenched corridor between the Alps to the east and the hills of the Ardennes to the west, where the river runs broad and steady southward toward the Mediterranean. Valence itself was a pleasant provincial town, with a cathedral, a market square, and the quiet routines of a place that had been settled for centuries. The young officer lived there in rented rooms, ate simple meals, and spent his days in the ordinary duties of a junior artillery officer, inspecting equipment, supervising drills, writing reports. In his free hours, Napoleon read. He read extensively and with great concentration: history, geography, philosophy, the natural sciences. He kept notebooks in which he recorded thoughts and observations, and he wrote long letters to his family in Corsica. He was at this time a slim, somewhat pale young man, with dark eyes and a serious expression, not particularly distinguished in appearance but with an air of quiet intensity that people sometimes noticed. He lived economically, as his pay was modest and his family's finances were not abundant, and he moved between a small number of simple pleasures: his books, his walks along the Rhône, occasional evenings at the theatre when he could afford it. The theatre in France at this period was a significant part of cultural life, not only in Paris but in the provincial cities. In Valence, as in other towns of the south, there were performances of plays and operas that brought audiences together in the gentle sociability of a shared evening. The repertoire often included works by the great playwrights of the previous century, Molière, Racine, Corneille, as well as newer works that reflected the changing tastes of the age. To sit in the candlelit warmth of a small theatre, with the murmur of conversation around you and the slow opening of a curtain onto a painted stage, was one of the quiet pleasures available to someone of Napoleon's station in the France of the 1780s. He was transferred and reassigned several times over the following years, returning periodically to Corsica on extended leave. The island remained important to him in these early years. His family was there, and the question of Corsican politics was one he followed with genuine interest. He had inherited from his father a certain engagement with public affairs, and during his leaves on the island he involved himself in local civic life, participating in debates and writing a short history of Corsica. The island was, in these years, still adjusting to French administration, and there were layers of local loyalty and political complexity that a young man of Napoleon's background could not entirely ignore. France in the late 1780s was moving through a period of economic difficulty and increasing social tension. Harvests had been poor, bread prices had risen, and the old structures of taxation and privilege were being questioned in pamphlets, in coffee houses, in the deliberative bodies that the king had convened to address the financial crisis. The atmosphere in Paris and in the cities was one of heightened discussion, not yet dramatic, but quietly charged in the way that precedes significant change. People who were attentive noticed it, and Napoleon, who read the newspapers carefully and paid attention to the tenor of public conversation, was certainly among them. The summer of 1789 brought changes to France that were deep and lasting. In Paris, events unfolded over several weeks that reshaped the legal and political structure of the country in fundamental ways. Old institutions dissolved, new ones were proposed, and the language of rights and representation that had been circulating in philosophical texts for decades began to take on the practical weight of legislation and public declaration. These changes moved through the provinces at different speeds, reaching some places quickly and others more slowly, absorbed differently depending on local circumstances and existing loyalties. For Napoleon, stationed in various postings during this period, the changes were something to be observed and considered with his characteristic analytical detachment. He was not a man given to strong political passions in the ideological sense, but he was acutely aware of how shifting conditions created new possibilities for someone of his abilities and ambitions. The old army had been organized around noble birth, and positions of high command had been effectively closed to men like himself, regardless of their talent. The new order was beginning to open those positions on the basis of merit and performance, a change whose significance for his own prospects he understood clearly. In the years that followed, Napoleon continued his military service, following the ordinary progressions of a capable officer in a rapidly changing institution. The French army of the early revolutionary period was being transformed. Its officer corps was changing as many of the old nobility emigrated, its tactics were evolving under the pressure of new ideas, and its relationship with the civilian government was shifting. New men were rising in ways that would have been impossible under the old order, and Napoleon was among them, moving steadily upward through a combination of technical skill, tactical understanding, and a calm, methodical approach to the problems that came his way. He was in Corsica during some of the most turbulent years of the revolution, involved in the complex local politics of the island, which were being pulled in several different directions at once by French patriotism, Corsican particularism, and the influence of various factions and personalities. The family was eventually forced to leave the island under difficult circumstances, settling on the French mainland as refugees of a kind, dependent on the goodwill of the republic they had decided to align themselves with. Laetitia brought her children across the water with characteristic composure, and the family settled in Toulon, the great naval port on the Mediterranean coast of Provence. Toulon in the early 1790s was a busy, working city, a place of dockyards and naval stores, of sailors and merchants, of the smell of salt water and tar that clings to port towns everywhere. The harbor was one of the finest natural anchorages in the Mediterranean, deep and sheltered, capable of holding a large fleet. The old town climbed the hillsides around the port in narrow streets, with houses whose shuttered windows and terracotta rooftops gave the place a warm, slightly dusty character that belonged entirely to the south of France. It was here that Napoleon came to the attention of the wider French military establishment in a way that would alter his trajectory significantly. A siege was underway at Toulon, a long, complicated affair involving foreign forces and French royalist sympathizers, and Napoleon, arriving in the late summer of 1793, took charge of the artillery component of the French Republican forces. He directed the placement of guns with careful attention to the terrain, identified the points from which the city could be made untenable for the forces holding it, and managed the siege operations with a methodical competence that impressed his superiors. When the city finally fell to the Republican forces, the success was attributed in large part to the work of the young artillery officer. He was promoted, and his name became known among those who managed the French military. In the aftermath of Toulon, Napoleon's career continued its upward movement through the intricate, sometimes hazardous landscape of revolutionary France. He moved between Paris and the provinces, between periods of active duty and periods of enforced idleness that he used for reading and thinking. Paris in these years was a city of great energy and also of great uncertainty, a place where the atmosphere could shift from one month to the next, where careers could rise quickly and fall just as quickly, where the ability to navigate political complexity was as important as any professional skill. Napoleon navigated it with care. The city itself, through all its political transformations, retained the physical character it had accumulated over centuries. The great buildings, the Louvre, the Tuileries, Notre Dame, stood as they always had, their stones weathered to warm grey by the decades and centuries of Parisian air. The Seine continued its patient passage through the city, carrying the reflections of the sky on its broad surface, and the gardens of the Palais Royal remained a place where people gathered in the evenings to walk and talk. The coffee houses were still full. The booksellers along the river still spread their wares in open boxes. Beneath the surface agitation of political life, the texture of the city continued. In the spring of 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy, a force that had been stationed on the border between France and the Italian peninsula, in a position of relative stagnation. The Alps formed the backdrop to this appointment, those great mountains that separate France from Italy and that, in the 18th century, were crossed by a limited number of passes, each one a significant geographical feature in its own right. The army Napoleon found at the frontier was tired and poorly supplied, but it had the essential qualities of a fighting force, experienced men, capable subordinate officers, and the physical endurance that comes from long campaigning. The Italian peninsula at this period was a patchwork of states and territories under various kinds of rule: the Kingdom of Sardinia in the northwest, the Duchy of Milan under Austrian administration, the Papal States across the center, the Kingdom of Naples in the south, and the Republic of Venice in the northeast, still maintaining the forms of its ancient independence. Each had its own character, its own capital city, its own traditions of governance and culture. The cities of northern Italy, Turin, Milan, Bologna, Venice, were old places with deep histories, their streets and piazzas shaped by centuries of civic life, their palaces and churches representing accumulations of art and architecture that were without parallel in Europe. As the French army moved through this landscape, it passed through towns and villages that had known the movement of armies before. The peninsula had been fought over for centuries, and the traces of that long history were visible in the fortifications on hilltops, the walled towns on defensible ridges, the bridges that carried roads across the rivers of the Po Valley. The Po Valley itself is a broad, flat agricultural plain, one of the most fertile in Europe, where the fields in spring are a vivid, quiet green and the distant Alps form a white wall along the northern horizon. The rivers cross it, the Ticino, the Adda, the Mincio, moving slowly through flat country toward their meeting with the Po and then the Adriatic. Napoleon moved through this landscape with characteristic speed and attention to organization. The army lived off the country as much as possible, supplemented by supply trains that he organized with careful attention. He corresponded extensively with Paris, writing long, detailed dispatches that described the situation on the ground with precision and proposed his intentions with clarity. He also wrote to Josephine. Josephine de Beauharnais was a woman of Creole origins, born on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, who had come to France as a young woman and had lived through the Revolution with elegance and resilience. She was a widow with 2 children, possessed of a natural charm and a social ease that made her widely liked in the circles of Paris society in which she moved. Napoleon had met her in Paris in the autumn of 1795, and their relationship had developed quickly. They married in March 1796, just days before he left for Italy, and in the months that followed he wrote her letters that were remarkable for their emotional intensity, long passages of longing and devotion that contrasted with the controlled precision of his military correspondence. Josephine, for her part, moved in Parisian society with the relaxed confidence of someone entirely at home in it. She had a gift for friendship and for creating comfortable, pleasant environments around herself. Her house, when Napoleon was away, was a gathering place for people of various backgrounds and opinions, artists, politicians, army officers, society figures, and the atmosphere she created was one of relaxed elegance rather than formal stiffness. She was fond of flowers and gardens, and wherever she lived she surrounded herself with them. The 18 months Napoleon spent in Italy were a period of continuous movement and activity, and through it all the ordinary life of the Italian peninsula went on around the margins of the military campaign. Farmers worked their fields. Merchants conducted their business. In the cities, people continued the daily patterns that urban life generates: the morning markets, the midday meals, the afternoon quiet, the evening promenade. The churches that dominated the skylines of Italian towns, their bell towers and domes visible from miles away across the flat countryside, continued to mark the hours and the seasons with their bells, as they had for centuries. Milan, the great city of the Lombard plain, was a place of considerable sophistication and cultural vitality when the French arrived in the spring of 1796. It had been under Spanish and then Austrian administration for generations, and its upper classes had absorbed the refinements that those connections brought, while retaining a distinctly Italian character in their domestic life and their relationship to the arts. The city's streets were laid out with the regularity that characterizes much of northern Italian urbanism, and its palaces and churches contained collections of painting and sculpture that had been assembled over centuries. The Duomo, the great cathedral that dominated the central piazza, was one of the most elaborate Gothic structures in Europe, its white marble facade and forest of spires catching the light differently at different hours of the day. After the Italian campaigns, Napoleon returned to France in 1797, arriving in Paris to a reception that reflected the regard in which he had come to be held. He was 28 years old, slim still, with the same serious expression and dark eyes, but now with an authority and a presence that had not been there before. Paris received him with the quiet enthusiasm of a city that appreciated success, and he settled for a time into the rhythms of Parisian life: meetings with officials, social engagements, attendance at the Institute of France, of which he had been made a member. The Institute was one of the remarkable institutions of the period, a gathering of the most distinguished minds in France across all fields of knowledge, from the exact sciences to the humanities, established to replace the old royal academies that had been dissolved during the Revolution. Napoleon valued his membership and attended its sessions with genuine interest. He was curious about science and technology in a practical way, and the company of men who worked systematically to extend human knowledge appealed to him. He would retain this interest throughout his life, and his later patronage of scientific institutions and expeditions reflected a consistent regard for empirical inquiry. The expedition to Egypt, which began in 1798, was one of the most remarkable ventures of the period, a military and scientific undertaking that sent a large French force to the eastern Mediterranean along with a commission of scholars, artists, and scientists whose task was to study Egypt systematically and comprehensively. The expedition's scientific dimension was taken seriously, and the scholars who accompanied it, engineers, naturalists, physicians, historians, cartographers, worked with genuine rigor to document what they found. The voyage to Egypt took the fleet across the Mediterranean, that sea whose blue-green water had carried human traffic for thousands of years. The crossing passed through the central Mediterranean, past the island of Malta, and then southeast toward the African coast. Traveling by sea in the late 18th century was a slow and often tedious business, even in favorable conditions. Days passed in the monotonous rhythm of wind and water, broken by meals and by whatever occupations the passengers could find for themselves. Napoleon used the voyage to read and to discuss ideas with the scholars who were accompanying the expedition. Egypt in 1798 was ruled by the Mamluks, a warrior caste of predominantly Turkish origin whose power had persisted for centuries alongside the nominal authority of the Ottoman Sultan. The country's landscape was ancient and distinctive, the narrow ribbon of green along the Nile, the great delta where the river spread into the sea, the desert that began at the edge of cultivation and extended without interruption to the horizon. The heat was intense for men accustomed to the temperate climate of France, and the light was brighter and more relentless than anything they had known at home. Alexandria, the first major city the expedition encountered, was a place of deep historical resonance. The city that Alexander of Macedon had founded more than 2,000 years before, that had been one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world. In 1798 it was a modest port town, its ancient glories largely buried under centuries of accumulated settlement, its population a mixture of Arabs, Greeks, Jews, and various other communities that lived in the layered way of Mediterranean port cities. Beyond Alexandria, along the Nile, the great monuments of pharaonic Egypt waited, the pyramids at Giza, visible from a great distance across the flat desert, the temples at Luxor and Karnak, the valley where the pharaohs had been buried in rock-cut tombs. Cairo was the largest city in Egypt, a sprawling, ancient place of narrow streets and covered markets, of minarets and the call to prayer echoing across rooftops, of the smells of spice and dust and river water. The French established themselves there and set about the work of administering a country that was unlike anything they had known. A different language, a different religion, a different climate, different rhythms of daily life structured around the flooding of the Nile and the requirements of agriculture in an arid landscape. The scholars of the expedition worked steadily in this environment, measuring the monuments, cataloguing the flora and fauna, sketching the temples and the inscriptions on their walls, laying the foundations for what would become, in later years, the discipline of Egyptology. Napoleon returned to France in 1799, leaving Egypt while the expedition was still underway. The return voyage across the Mediterranean was swift, and he arrived in Paris in October to find the political situation in a state of flux. The government was unstable, The country was exhausted by years of war and political turbulence, and there was a widespread sense that the existing arrangements were not adequate to the challenges France faced. The coup of the 18th Brumaire, named for the revolutionary calendar date, brought him to a position of central authority in the French government as first consul, one of 3 consuls assigned to oversee the executive functions of the state, though in practice the most important of the 3. The consulate period that followed was one of intense administrative and legislative activity. The French state was reorganized in fundamental ways during these years. New legal codes were drafted, new administrative structures were put in place, new institutions were established. The Napoleonic Code, the comprehensive legal framework that replaced the patchwork of local customs and royal ordinances that had governed French civil life, was one of the lasting achievements of this period. It established clear principles for property rights, family law, and commercial transactions, written in language that aimed to be accessible and consistent, and it became a model for legal reform in many parts of Europe and beyond. The Tuileries Palace, where Napoleon established himself as first consul, was a grand 17th-century structure that stood between the Louvre and the gardens that bore the palace's name. Its rooms were large and formal, decorated with the accumulated furnishings of French royal taste over many decades, and the life conducted within them took on, gradually, a ceremonial quality that reflected both the dignity appropriate to the head of state and Napoleon's own instinct for order and deliberate presentation. The household was well organized, meals were served at regular hours, working sessions were scheduled precisely, and the flow of papers and correspondence that required attention was managed systematically. Josephine created around herself the atmosphere she had always favored, warm, elegant, and comfortable. She had acquired Malmaison, a country house in the western suburbs of Paris, where she indulged her passion for gardens and flowers. The gardens at Malmaison became one of the most admired in France, planted with species from around the world, tended with devoted attention, and visited by botanists and horticulturalists who came from Paris to study the collections. Josephine corresponded with gardeners and plant collectors on several continents, acquiring specimens that were grown in the greenhouses she had built, and the roses she cultivated at Malmaison were particularly celebrated. The Paris that Napoleon governed from the Tuileries was a city of roughly 500,000 people, a great, dense, noisy, smelling, beautiful city that extended along both banks of the Seine and reached outward into suburbs and villages that were slowly being absorbed by urban growth. The central streets were busy from early morning, merchants opening their shops, water carriers making their rounds, servants going to market with baskets over their arms, lawyers and officials making their way to the courts and ministries where the business of the state was conducted. The printing shops produced newspapers in quantities that reflected the high level of political consciousness in the city, and the bookshops that lined the quays along the river were busy places where people browsed and discussed. The city was still largely medieval in its street plan through much of its extent. The old pattern of narrow lanes and irregular blocks persisted in the neighborhoods that had grown up over centuries without the benefit of deliberate planning. But the grandes rues, the major arteries, were wide enough for carriages to pass comfortably, and the great new projects of public architecture and infrastructure that Napoleon initiated were beginning, gradually, to add new elements to the urban landscape. Bridges were built across the Seine, columns were raised in public squares, and new streets were opened in neighborhoods that had been too dense and labyrinthine. Beyond Paris, the France that Napoleon governed was an enormous, varied country of some 30 million people. In the Norman countryside, apple orchards stretched across rolling hills, and the farmhouses were built of the local stone in ways that had not changed in generations. In Provence, the lavender fields of the Vaucluse spread across the hillsides in long, fragrant rows, and the pace of life in the villages moved to a slower rhythm dictated by the heat of summer and the mild winters. In Alsace, on the eastern frontier, the villages had a distinctly Germanic character: timber-framed houses with steep roofs, stork nests on chimneys, and a culinary tradition that reflected the border country between two cultures. In Brittany, the stone farmhouses crouched against the Atlantic winds, and the sea was always present in the life of the coastal communities. Napoleon traveled this country more than most of his predecessors had done, not always comfortably, since the roads in many parts of France were still unpaved and travel in bad weather was slow and difficult, but regularly and with attention to the condition of what he found. He rode, or traveled by carriage, covering distances that even by modern standards seem considerable, moving between Paris and the various military headquarters and administrative centers that required his attention. The French road network, which had been among the best in Europe in the 18th century, was being improved during his administration. New roads were built, old ones were repaired, and the system of staging posts that allowed carriage travel to proceed in reasonable comfort was maintained and extended. In 1804, Napoleon was proclaimed Emperor of the French in a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral that brought together the civic and religious authorities of France in a formal acknowledgement of the new order. The ceremony was elaborate and carefully planned, combining elements of ancient coronation ritual with innovations that reflected the particular circumstances of post-revolutionary France. Pope Pius VII had traveled from Rome to attend and to confer apostolic blessing on the occasion, a journey of several weeks across the Alps that the elderly pontiff undertook with the equanimity of a man accustomed to the demands of his office. The cathedral was decorated for the event with hangings and ornaments that transformed its medieval interior into something more immediately splendid and theatrical. The empire that Napoleon now headed was the largest political entity in Western Europe, incorporating not only France but a constellation of dependent kingdoms, allied states, and directly administered territories that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Prussia and Austria. His brothers and sisters ruled various parts of this enlarged domain: Joseph in Naples, Louis in the Netherlands, Jerome in Westphalia, while other territories were governed by marshals and officials of various kinds. The management of this extended empire required constant correspondence and continuous attention to the flow of information between Paris and the periphery. The courts of Europe in this era were elaborate social institutions with long traditions and carefully maintained hierarchies. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, was a city of perhaps 200,000 people, with a court culture that had been developing for centuries and that placed enormous value on ceremony, precedence, and the accumulated symbols of dynastic legitimacy. The Hofburg Palace, where the Habsburg emperors resided, was a vast complex of buildings accumulated over generations, its architecture reflecting the taste of successive centuries, its interiors furnished with the art and treasures that centuries of collecting and patronage had assembled. The social life of Vienna centered on the court calendar: balls, concerts, hunts, and formal occasions that brought the aristocracy of the empire together in the ways that aristocratic life required. Berlin, the capital of Prussia, had a different character, younger as a great city, more recently risen to prominence, with a certain ambitious newness about its architecture and institutions that reflected the rapid growth of Prussian power in the 18th century. Frederick the Great, who had died in 1786, had left his mark on the city in the Rococo-inflected buildings of Sanssouci and in the philosophical and literary culture he had patronized, and the Berlin of Napoleon's era still lived somewhat in the shadow of that formidable predecessor. The city sat on the flat North German plain, among lakes and forests, and had something of the landscape's quality, broad and somewhat austere, with a climate colder and windier than Paris. St. Petersburg, far to the east in Russia, was perhaps the most deliberately created of the great European capitals, a city built from scratch on the marshy delta of the Neva River by Peter the Great in the early 18th century, intended as Russia's window to the west. It was a city of canals and islands, of long, wide avenues that froze in winter under thick snow, of Baroque and neoclassical palaces that faced each other across the Neva, their facades of pale yellow and white reflecting in the water. The winters there were severe, long, dark, and cold in ways that Western Europeans who visited found deeply impressive, and the brief northern summers were correspondingly bright, the sky still pale at midnight in the weeks around the solstice. These cities and the societies within them constituted the world in which Napoleon moved as a European figure, corresponding with their rulers, negotiating with their diplomats, and moving armies through their territories. The diplomacy of the period was conducted in French, which had been the common language of European courts and educated classes for a century, and the forms of diplomatic exchange, the letters of credential, the formal audiences, the exchange of courtesies between sovereigns, followed protocols that had been developed over generations and that gave even adversarial relationships a surface civility. The road between Paris and Vienna was one of the great routes of European travel in this era, a journey of several weeks by carriage, passing through the gentle hills of Alsace, crossing the Rhine into German territories, moving through the varied landscape of southern Germany and the Danube Valley, and arriving finally in the Austrian capital. Along the way were the posting houses where travelers changed horses and rested, the inns of the German towns where meals were served at long communal tables, the customs posts at territorial boundaries where papers were checked and duties assessed. Travelers on this route passed through a dozen different political jurisdictions, each with its own currency and its own regulations, and the accumulation of minor inconveniences was part of the texture of European travel before the simplifications of the 19th century. Napoleon's household, as it had evolved by the middle years of the empire, was a large and complex institution, a court in the proper sense, with officers and chamberlains and ladies-in-waiting, with a detailed protocol governing who had access to the emperor and on what occasions, with kitchens and stables and wardrobes and all the apparatus that maintaining an imperial household required. Meals at the imperial table were formal occasions, conducted according to a fixed protocol, with courses arriving in sequence and a staff of several dozen involved in the preparation and service of each dinner. Napoleon himself ate quickly, more quickly than the elaborate service required, and was often finished before those around him had progressed far through their meal. His working day was long and intensive. He rose early and spent the morning hours in a series of meetings and working sessions with ministers and officials, moving through the various business of government with great rapidity. He had an exceptional ability to shift his attention from one subject to another without losing his thread in either, and the ministers who worked with him noted both his command of detail and his capacity for synthetic, large-scale thinking. He dictated a great deal: correspondence, instructions, memoranda, and the secretaries who worked with him developed systems for keeping pace with the flow of output he generated. In the evenings, when official business permitted, there were social occasions: dinners, theatrical performances, concerts. The court had established its own musicians and performers, and the cultural life of the empire was supported by patronage that reflected both Napoleon's genuine interest in certain arts and his understanding of culture as a domain through which prestige and authority could be expressed. The opera in Paris was a grand institution with a distinguished history, and performances there were attended by the fashionable world of the capital with the kind of regular devotion that opera attracted in this period throughout Europe. The repertoire was broad: Italian opera, French opera, ballet, and the singers and dancers who performed there were figures of considerable public celebrity. The broader cultural world of the Napoleonic era was one of great richness and variety. The painters of the period, David, Ingres, Gros, and others in their circle, produced work of extraordinary quality and ambition, drawing on the classical tradition while inflecting it with the particular concerns of their own time. The sculptors created works that would grace the public spaces of Paris for generations. The architects conceived projects of monumental scale: the Arc de Triomphe, the column in the Place Vendôme, the broad streets and public buildings that were gradually transforming the appearance of the capital. And beyond the official patronage, there was a lively commercial culture of publishing and printmaking, of small theaters and popular entertainments, of fashion and gastronomy that constituted the everyday cultural life of a great city. The fashions of the Napoleonic period had evolved considerably from the elaborate court dress of the old monarchy. Women's clothing had simplified in the revolutionary years, adopting the high-waisted, flowing silhouettes inspired by classical antiquity, in light fabrics that moved easily and gave the figures of the period their distinctive appearance. Men's dress had similarly simplified, the elaborate wigs and knee breeches of the 18th century giving way to the tailored coats and trousers that would remain the basis of men's formal dress for the following century and beyond. Jewelry and accessories were still elaborate on formal occasions, but the general direction was toward a cleaner, more disciplined aesthetic than the ornate extravagance of the previous era. Food in this period was governed by the seasonal rhythms of agriculture and by the regional traditions that had accumulated over centuries. In Paris, the first of what would become the great restaurants were establishing themselves. Establishments where a guest could sit at a private table and choose from a printed list of dishes, a relatively new concept that was spreading through the city. Before the Revolution, the finest cooking had been confined to aristocratic households and to the gilded establishments that served specific categories of food under strict regulations. The new restaurants offered something more flexible and democratic. A place where anyone who could afford it might eat well and comfortably. Napoleon himself was not particularly interested in food for its own sake. He ate quickly and without great ceremony in private, and the elaborate meals of the imperial table were more about protocol than about personal pleasure. But he understood the social importance of hospitality and the table, and the kitchens of the imperial household were staffed and equipped to produce the elaborate cuisine that formal occasions required. The pastrycooks and confectioners who served the court produced works of extraordinary technical skill, elaborate spun sugar constructions, elaborately decorated cakes and pastries, the architectural desserts that were a feature of grand dining in this period. The years between 1805 and 1812 saw the empire at the height of its territorial extent and its self-confidence. The great victories of the Middle Years, at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Wagram, had established France as the dominant power in continental Europe, and Napoleon as the preeminent figure of the age. The correspondence of the period, the memoirs and diaries of those who moved in his orbit, give a picture of a court and a government that were functioning at a high level of energy and effectiveness, managing an enormous range of affairs across a vast territory. The city of Paris in these years was changing physically as well as in its social composition. The grand projects of urban improvement that Napoleon had initiated were proceeding: new quays along the Seine, new markets, new fountains, the beginnings of the northern bank's transformation through the addition of wide, tree-lined streets. The city was growing, absorbing the villages that had previously stood at a comfortable distance from its outskirts, and the population was swelling as people from the provinces and from across the empire came to seek their fortunes in the capital. The café culture of the city was flourishing. The Palais Royal's galleries housed dozens of restaurants, cafés, and shops, and the gardens themselves were crowded on fine evenings with people of every description. The Loire Valley, that long, gentle reach of river and chateau country between Orleans and the Atlantic, was one of the landscapes that France associated most closely with its own identity, a place of soft light and rich soil, of wine and fruit and the slow movement of the river between willow-lined banks. The great chateaux of the Loire, Chambord, Chernonceau, Amboise, were among the most beautiful buildings in France, constructed in the 15th and 16th centuries by kings and courtiers who had found in the valley's mild climate and accessible rivers the ideal setting for their pleasure houses. Napoleon passed through this country on his journeys between Paris and the West, and the landscape would have been familiar to him from the maps and reports of the administrative region he governed. The roads of France, improved as they had been during his administration, still required several days to travel from Paris to the distant frontiers of the country. A journey from Paris to Lyon, in the Rhône Valley, took 2 days by the fastest post carriage. The journey from Paris to the Spanish border, through Bordeaux, took nearly a week. Travel through the mountains, the Alps or the Pyrenees, was always more difficult, dependent on weather and on the condition of the roads through the passes. In winter, the high passes could be closed entirely, and travelers had to wait in the foothill towns until the snow cleared enough to allow passage. The administrative machine that Napoleon had built to govern France and its dependencies was one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive that Europe had seen. The prefectural system, by which each department of France was administered by a prefect directly responsible to the central government in Paris, provided a uniform framework of governance across the enormous diversity of the country's regions and populations. The prefects were, typically, educated men of the professional classes who combined administrative competence with loyalty to the imperial regime, and they corresponded regularly with Paris on everything from the state of the roads to the mood of the local population. The mail that passed through this system was enormous. letters and dispatches moving in all directions across France and its dependencies, carried by the post riders who maintained regular schedules on the main roads. The speed of communication was the speed of a horse, and messages took days or weeks to travel the distances that electricity would later make instantaneous. In a world governed at this speed, decisions had to be made locally in the absence of instructions from the center, and the quality of the people at the regional and departmental level was consequently of great importance. Napoleon returned to France after the Russian campaign of 1812 in circumstances of great difficulty, but the city of Paris and the ordinary life of France continued in the ways that ordinary life does continue, adjusted and diminished in various ways by the requirements of prolonged war but not fundamentally disrupted. The farms of Burgundy still produced their wine, the fishing boats of Brittany still worked the Atlantic, the workshops of Lyon still wove their silk, and in the cafes of Paris men still read their newspapers and discussed the affairs of the day in the way that Parisian men had always done. The years of 1813 and 1814 brought a gradual narrowing of the imperial domain as the alliances against France tightened and the frontiers contracted. The capital itself was not touched until the final weeks of the campaign, when foreign troops entered Paris for the first time since the 100 Years' War, a moment that ended quietly, without the dramatic collapse that might have been expected, the city accepting the change with the pragmatic equanimity of a great metropolis that has endured many things. Napoleon's abdication and his exile to the island of Elba in 1814 removed him from the European stage in the way that the end of an era sometimes comes, not with a single decisive moment, but through a gradual accumulation of circumstances that made the final conclusion feel, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Elba is a small island off the Tuscan coast, rocky and warm, with a pleasant climate and a landscape of vineyards and olive groves. Napoleon spent the months of his exile there organizing the island's administration with his characteristic attention to detail, improving its roads and mines, receiving visitors, and reading. The brief return in 1815, the period known as the 100 Days, was a swift, dramatic episode in which Napoleon landed in the south of France with a small force and made his way to Paris without significant resistance, the army that had been sent to stop him attaching itself to his cause as he moved north through the spring countryside. He entered Paris in March and governed France again for 3 months, during which the pace of events was rapid and the outcome unresolved until the battle in the Belgian countryside that ended the enterprise. The island of St. Helena, where Napoleon spent the final years of his life, was one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, a small, volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic, equidistant from South America and Africa, exposed to the trade winds, with a landscape that ranged from the bleak and windswept near the shore to something more gentle and green in the interior where the elevation provided moisture. It was chosen for his final exile precisely because of its remoteness, and the years he spent there were years of diminishment and quiet. Longwood House, where he lived, was a modest establishment by the standards of what he had known. Low-ceilinged rooms, gardens that never quite recovered from the damp Atlantic air, a staff of attendants and companions who had chosen to accompany him into exile. He spent his days reading, his library was substantial and he worked through it systematically, dictating his memoirs to the companions who took turns as his secretaries, walking in the garden when his health permitted, and engaging in the social life that the small community of the island offered. He was treated with the formal courtesy due to a prisoner of significance, and the British governor of the island maintained a watchful, conscientious oversight that Napoleon found irksome. The memoirs he dictated on St. Helena were a careful and deliberate project, an attempt to shape how posterity would understand his life and his actions, to present the narrative of his career in the most favorable light, and to leave a record that would outlast the circumstances of his current confinement. He worked on this project with the same systematic energy he brought to other undertakings, discussing events and decisions with his companions, correcting drafts, and producing a body of material that would, in the decades after his death, become enormously influential in shaping the historical memory of the Napoleonic era. The climate of St. Helena was variable. The trade winds brought clouds and dampness for much of the year, and the isolation of the island meant that the seasons changed without the associations that the seasons carry in Europe, the relationship to agricultural rhythms and cultural traditions that makes time feel continuous with what has come before. The days on the island were regular and somewhat monotonous. Meals at fixed hours, exercise when possible, reading and dictation in the afternoon, conversation in the evening. The society of the island was limited to the small group of companions and attendants who had followed him, the officers of the British garrison, and the island's small permanent population. Napoleon died at Longwood in May 1821, at the age of 51. The cause was disputed then and has been discussed by physicians and historians in the years since. A slow, wasting illness that had diminished him gradually over the months before the end. He died in the early evening, attended by his companions, in the low-ceilinged house on the windy Atlantic island that had been his home for 6 years. The news took weeks to reach Europe, carried by ship across the slow distances of the ocean, and when it arrived in Paris it was received with the complicated feelings that attend the death of someone who has been simultaneously admired and feared, celebrated and contested. The world he had known was already changing in the years after his exile. The cities were growing, the roads were improving, and the first railways were beginning, in England, to demonstrate the possibilities of mechanical locomotion. The political arrangements he had helped to create or to transform were being revised and renegotiated by the congresses and treaties of the post-war period, as the powers of Europe tried to establish a settlement that would provide stability after the long turbulence. France itself was adjusting to a restored monarchy, the old ceremonies revived and the old court reconstituted, though in a form that could not entirely ignore what had passed. The physical France of the Napoleonic era, its landscapes, its cities, its villages and roads, persisted through all these changes in its essential character. The Loire still moved slowly through its valley, the wheat of the Beauce still grew in its flat, immense fields, the vineyards of Burgundy and Bordeaux still turned golden in the autumn, and the mountains of the Alps and Pyrenees still defined the southern and eastern limits of the country in the same way they always had. The bridges Napoleon had built still crossed the rivers, and some of the roads his engineers had improved still carried traffic through the countryside. The memory of the Napoleonic years settled into the French imagination in layers, the legislative achievements that survived the political changes, the architectural monuments that altered the appearance of Paris, the military legends that grew in the telling through the remainder of the 19th century, and the more personal stories that former soldiers and officials carried in their memories and eventually wrote down. The Code Napoleon, revised and adapted over the decades, remained the foundation of French civil law and spread, through French influence in various parts of the world, far beyond the frontiers of France. The streets of Paris that Napoleon had known, the quays along the Seine, the Rue de Rivoli with its arcades, the Tuileries gardens where he had walked in the evenings of his empire, continued their lives as streets, as places where the daily activity of a great city concentrated and dispersed in the rhythms that urban life generates. The stones of the paving knew nothing of the feet that had crossed them. The Seine moved as it had always moved, patient and indifferent to the events that had taken place on its banks, carrying the light of the sky on its broad surface as it passed through the heart of the city toward the sea. The island of Corsica, where it had all begun, continued its quiet Mediterranean existence, the marquee growing and flowering through the seasons, the sea glittering in the summer afternoons, the harbor of Ajaccio reflecting the light in the early mornings before the town had fully woken to the day. The house where the family had lived stood in the narrow streets of the old town, a modest stone building whose rooms held no trace of the extraordinary passage of time that had unfolded in the world outside its walls. The sea wind came in from the west as it always had, carrying the salt smell of the open water and the warmth of the sun that lay on the Mediterranean through the long months of summer. The lemon trees of the south of France were flowering in some garden as Napoleon's ships had crossed and recrossed the Mediterranean, their white blossoms small and quiet in the warmth. The bees moved among the lavender of Provence and the thyme of the Garrigue, doing their ancient, unhurried work. The rivers of France moved toward their several seas, carrying the rains of distant mountains, the soft brown soil of the valleys, the reflections of the clouds that crossed the sky above them. The seasons turned, as they always do, without hurry.